Our topic today is going to be about plant ecology. Remember that ecology is the interaction between different groups of organisms, whether that be individuals or populations, species, communities, ecosystems, and the environments that they interact with. And those environments can be abiotic, meaning non-living, or biotic, meaning other members of the living community around that plant. Today we're just going to focus on abiotic conditions, and specifically the adaptations that plants have to allow them to function well in the habitats that they're in. In other material we'll talk about biotic adaptations and biotic ecological factors. So just a reminder that an adaptation is some sort of attribute or structure. That attribute could be a physiological attribute, it could be a methylation process that happens, it could be some function, it could be some plant part that suits a particular organism, species, individual, etc. to its environment. And again, that could be biotic or abiotic. So here we have a praying mantis that looks a lot like the flower that it's hidden in. That praying mantis has a suite of adaptations that allow it to be a successful predator. One of those adaptations, of course, is the color adaptation. Adaptations are always going to be the result of evolution by natural selection. I could go on, as you know, throughout a whole semester about the process of evolution by natural selection, but I'm just going to assume that you remember how the process works. Now, in terms of adaptations that we're going to talk about, I want to structure the organization of this to a series of basically things that plants need. If a plant is going to be successful, if a plant is going to survive and thrive and reproduce, pass on its genes, it has to have adaptations to a bunch of things in its abiotic environment and some other things that are part of its biotic environment. The abiotic environment includes access to light, access to CO2, sufficient water, adequate temperatures for reproduction and survival, access to enough nutrients and acquisition of nutrients, and then storage of either the nutrients or the energy that it captures during photosynthesis. Reproduction we've already talked about a little bit in class. Dispersal we've talked a tiny bit about, and then of course plant defense is going to be under the herbivory material. So today I'm just going to focus on these other items, these plant needs that are covered in black here. This isn't a plant physiology class, so we're not going to go through all of the steps of photosynthesis. It's not a biochemistry class, so we're not going to get into all the enzymes and the transfer of ATPs, etc. But I want you to remember the basic fundamentals of photosynthesis. During the process of photosynthesis, light energy comes in, gets combined with CO2 in the leaf. The leaf in its chloroplast utilizes that light energy and to capture and form carbon dioxide and form that into starch or sugars. So these are the products of photosynthesis, these sugars that are made within the plant. During that process, a little bit of water is used, but also a little bit of water is released from the leaf surface. Those sugars, once they've been captured within the plant, can get moved around into different organs like storage organs or into leaves. They could be moved around into fruits. They could be used as part of the secondary plant defense pathway that allows plants to have defensive chemicals. So the basic fundamental equation then involves light, carbon dioxide, and a little bit of water. And on the other end of the equation we've got the production of glucose, these sugars, and then the release of water and the release of oxygen. During that process, the plant, again, is not really moving around at all, but it's got to do a lot of pretty complicated things. And it's got to do all those things within leaves, sometimes stems. So let's talk about the first one of these environmental aspects that a plant has to deal with. That is access to light. And what I'm going to do for the rest of this presentation is I'm going to talk about adaptations for cases where there's too little light. Then I'm going to talk about adaptations where there's too much light. And I'm going to do that for all of the abiotic factors that we cover throughout the rest of this video. So let's talk about light first in terms of cases where there is too little light. What you're seeing here on the left is a picture of a Costa Rican wet forest where there's so much humidity that you can see the sunlight coming through. And if you're a plant down here on the bottom of the ground, you would get very, very little light. An adaptation for a plant that gets very little light is, there's lots of different possibilities. One, growing very tall, being able to store energy until there is an opening that allows that plant to shoot up into the canopy. Potentially large flat leaves that can capture what tiny little bits of dappled sunlight come through the openings from other plants. Or maybe being active early in the season. So here we have a small tree that's just kind of waiting around for a gap to open, and when that gap opens, the plant can grow very tall. So the ability to grow very tall then is an adaptation to gain access to light. Being an epiphyte, or growing on another plant, is another adaptation for getting access to greater amounts of light. Being a vine is another adaptation for gaining access to light. So there are lots of adaptations that plants may have that allow them to get increased access to light. On the other end of the continuum, there might be too much light. 95% of sunlight absorbed by a leaf becomes heat. If you're that plant, you're generating a lot of heat, you're absorbing a lot of heat, and that can cause problems. And we'll talk about temperature in a little bit. So what do plants do? What can plants do if they get overheated? Well, one of the things that they can do is transpire, which is the loss of water through the surface of the leaves through the stomata. That cooling action of the water across the surface of the leaf takes with it a lot of energy and a lot of heat, and that cools the plant down. Another way that leaves cool off is through convection, which is the movement of air around the leaf. And so there will be adaptations that come along with to maximize transpiration, or to minimize transpiration, to maximize or minimize convection. One of the downsides of increased temperature is that most biochemical reactions in all living organisms are temperature dependent. And so if we think about the environmental gradient of temperature, there's an optimal temperature that a species might be adapted to, and they can tolerate some range below or above that optimal temperature, and the plant's performance in terms of survival, reproduction, etc. is going to be pretty close to its optimum. If the plant either gets too cold, or let's go with gets too warm, there will be a temperature that is so high that the plant can no longer reproduce, but it might still survive. And it might still be able to grow. But then if the temperature continues to increase, it might pass a point where it can no longer grow, yet it can still survive. And the temperature might eventually get so warm that that plant can no longer even survive, and then it is outside of its range of acceptable habitat. Same can happen for temperatures that are too low. A plant can freeze, in which case it can no longer survive, or maybe a plant gets so cold that it can never really grow adequately to compete with other species, or maybe it's just cold enough so that it no longer can reproduce. But in general, plants have these thermal performance curves that are highly dependent on the temperature that the plant is adapted to. At high temperatures, these enzymes denature and respiration increases too much, to the point where it no longer can energetically manage living in that habitat. Now, these thermal performance curves are traits that vary across different locations, that vary across different species. Plants that are adapted to really hot environments tend to have thermal performance curves that are shifted to the right. Plants that are tolerant of very cold temperatures typically are not tolerant of warm temperatures, and so their thermal performance curves are shifted to the left. One thing that can extend the thermal tolerance range of a plant is to have adaptations that allow the plant to cool off. So different shapes of leaves can have an influence on the convection loss of heat from the surface of the leaf. If the leaf absorbs too much temperature, if it absorbs too much energy, then the temperature of the leaf will increase, and then it will fall outside of its optimal thermal performance curve, and then the plant will start to use more energy to survive and respirate than it will actually be able to capture. Evaporation is transpiration, and that loss of water from the surface does help keep the temperature lower, but the combination of leaf shape to maximize convection or minimize convection and the loss of water from the surface of the leaf can have a major cooling effect. But unfortunately, water loss increases with temperature, so what that means is that adaptations for water conservation are often tied to adaptations for maintaining the optimal temperature range. So if you look at this box or this figure on the left, a simple leaf that has entire margins is going to tend to be a leaf on a plant that has adequate water and not too much sunlight. But as leaves grow in more and more sunny environments, those leaves will tend to have greater and greater sinuses, greater and greater lobing area. And then some things that have these highly compound leaves like ashes and hickories tend to be a little bit more tolerant of high temperatures. And then finally, in lots of tropical areas, a lot of tropical plants will have these highly divided leaves, highly compound leaves with very small leaf surface area, but a lot of edge, and this edge of the leaf allows greater temperature loss through evaporative cooling and also greater convection. So the surface area to edge ratio can change substantially, and that's a major adaptation of plants' leaves. You can even see these physiological adaptations happening within one individual. If you look at, say, an oak tree in the bottom of the canopy where it's not really getting a lot of sunlight, those leaves will never really get too warm. And so oftentimes the leaves at the lower part of the canopy, where they're typically very shaded, will be much more or much less lobed, and leaves that are higher up in the canopy or exposed to sun all day will tend to have deeper sinuses. Another aspect of the energy balance has to do with ways that plants can maintain their temperature without losing too much water. So the loss of water, the opening and closing of stomata, the maintenance of temperature of a leaf is not involved just with water savings, but also with energy balance. So what are some of the ways that plants can maintain their proper temperature and not lose too much water or too much energy? Other adaptations that plants can have are to have high levels of pubescence on the coating or on the surface of the leaves, or to have very shiny or waxy coatings on the upper surfaces of leaves that allow plants to maintain internal water levels without losing a lot of water, without losing a lot, or while maintaining their proper temperature range. The downside of this is that lots of pubescence, especially on the upper surface of a leaf, will reduce the rate of photosynthesis. So these types of adaptations, highly pubescent leaf surfaces or high waxy coatings, tend to be restricted to plants that occur in very sunny environments. There are also plants that have adaptations for conducting photosynthesis during different water or light environments. Again, because this isn't a plant physiology class, we're not going to get into these processes too much. But the idea here is that it's not all the same mode of photosynthesis across all plants. Fundamentally, during the process of photosynthesis, CO2 needs to move into the surface of the cell through the stomata. And when the stomata open up, there's an opportunity for water vapor to be lost. That's good if there's plenty of water available, But if water needs to be conserved, yet CO2 still needs to be taken in through the stomata, then that makes for a pretty big restriction in what the plants can handle. So the guard cells are the cells that allow the stomata to open or close, and these are constantly they're constantly changing through time, opening, closing, allowing water out, but also allowing CO2 in. Other kinds of plants are able to do different forms of photosynthesis that either physically separate the stomata, the CO2 capture, from other parts of the cell where the CO2 could be potentially lost, or do more capture of CO2 in the nighttime, store the CO2 so that during the daytime when energy is available from sunlight, then they complete the rest of the photosynthetic cycle. Again, we're not going to get into the details of that. That's probably enough for now. The main issue is that physiologically and morphologically plants can be adapted to different water regimes.